Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Core Vocabulary 201 Descriptive Language. As with all the webinars in this series, today's training will be archived and can be accessed via the Angelman Syndrome Foundation website or on their YouTube channel. Today's webinar is number 24 in the series, which by year's end will include over 40 one-hour trainings. If you have not had an opportunity to view the full Core Vocabulary 101 webinar, you are encouraged to access it via the Angelman Syndrome Foundation website or their YouTube channel. Free access to these webinars for all is made possible by the generous support of the Angelman Syndrome Foundation and from the Foster Family Charitable Foundation, a family foundation established in Central California. Today we're going to continue our discussion of core vocabulary that began with Core Vocabulary 101. Some people are going to start using core vocabulary as part of their AAC system very slowly with really scripted applications and baby steps. And that is just fantastic. Putting one foot in front of the other, that's just what you need to be doing. As you get more experienced, you may begin to have questions about how to use the core words. Here you see some of the questions that I sometimes hear related to core vocabulary. See if you could relate to any of these. How are we supposed to model throughout the day across all sorts of activities with a limited set of core words? What should I do if I can't find the exact word that I need? How can I use core words if they don't match the situation or message I'm trying to model? Can I use other types of words with the core, or should I only use the core words? What about academic vocabulary? Do I teach that in addition to the core? And how can I talk or teach about a broad range of topics if I have such a limited number of words? So are these things that you think about? So if you do think about any of these questions, you're in luck, because today we're going to address one big question that I think really incorporates most of these smaller questions. They may seem diverse, but in fact they're really variations on a theme, which is, what do we do when there is a mismatch between the words we have available on our AAC system and the ones that we need for speaking and for learning? In order to address that big question and those small questions, we need to cover the following information today. By the end of this hour, you should have an understanding of the terms core vocabulary and fringe vocabulary. You should have an understanding of a tiered vocabulary system. You should know the relationship between core and fringe and the tiered system. And also you should have a good understanding of what a descriptive language approach is and how to do that. Here we can see our topics placed in our common planning tool of the 5 steps. We can see that when we're talking about vocabulary, we're really talking about the focus of learning for our students, and so that's a target. And when we look at a process for planning, we're looking at a team resource. So the descriptive language tools that are part of the webinar, that's going to be a team strategy, because it's a planning process that generates the words for instructions, but it's not directly implemented with the person that we're working with. So let's start with the basics of core vocabulary and then work toward some of the new information. So in Core Vocabulary 101, we identified core vocabulary as the research-based set of words that are most commonly used by speakers. And here we have a nice graphic from Prenke Romick Company's Language Lab that describes core words as being a small number of high-frequency words representing the range of parts of speech that can be used across a variety of environments and topics, and that represent about 80% of our spoken language. these are the words that we include as priorities in communication systems for our individuals with Angelman syndrome and complex communication needs. In that core vocabulary webinar, along with Caroline Musselwhite's aided language webinar, you were encouraged to focus on modeling these most common words with your child, student, or client and their communication system. So here are a couple of examples of core communication boards. The first one is from the Dynamic Learning Maps Alternate Assessment Consortium, and they have selected the first 40 words for their display, and you'll find in the resources documents much more information about this first 40, but you can see that it does meet the criteria for a core-based communication display. Here is a board of 150 core symbols that I created, and again you can see that it meets the criteria board that is core-based. And then lastly, this is an example from Deanna Wagner. This is the core portion of her board, and then she also has a flip, which would be the fringe portion that we'll be talking about next. One of the things I want to point out before we move on to that fringe vocabulary is regarding those 3 examples that we just saw of core. You can see a couple of things, I think, particularly for the 2 that are color-coded. One is that you don't see any orange, and that is because typically orange is the color used for nouns, and that core words are essentially non-nouns. So that's one of the quick ways to look at a system if it's color-coded and see what percentage of your displays are orange, and if they're a lot orange, then they may not be core-based. Second thing to point out is while these 3 boards all fit the definition of core displays, there's a range of quantity of words on each of the boards. And that's because there is no specific quantity of words required on a core display. There's no set number after which we end up in fringe land. So essentially, if you select words for a communication system by starting at the beginning of one of the frequency-based vocabulary lists, and then adding new words using that same process, moving up the list, then you are creating a core-based system. If you want a little bit more information, in addition to the core vocabulary webinar, which covers that extensively, excuse me, the webinar number 3, Does Your App Measure Up?, includes some more details about how to evaluate your AAC system and its contents, particularly with regard to the core component. Okay, so now we have the same grid that we use for the core vocabulary, but we've added in the fringe component. So let's talk about fringe vocabulary. The term fringe vocabulary refers to words that are less frequently used than the core and not as flexible. So there are a large number of fringe words, and again, they're occurring not as frequently. There's more of them, and so each individual one is not used as often. The majority of them are nouns or proper names, as shown here. Each word is really used in a more limited environment or topic, so they're not as, again, flexible as the core. They're more specific. And in our spoken language, we use core words for about 20% of our spoken language. So that is combined with our 80% of core, that's 100% right there. So here we've combined these 2 types of words. And what we see is that they can be represented along a continuum according to frequency and flexibility. These are 2 words that we've used a little bit in this discussion so far. Let me just stop and define them a little bit better. So frequency refers to how often a word is used in spoken or written language. So how often do I see the word go? A lot. And so that would be a high frequency word. The word, let's see, hippopotamus, not as much. So that's a lower frequency word. Flexibility refers to how many ways a word can be used or how many different meanings it can have. So the more meanings, the more flexible a word is. The more specific a word is, the less flexible it is. So what we can see from this graphic is that core words are more flexible and they occur more frequently. And fringe words are less flexible and they individually occur less frequently than core. The reason I put the numbers here, again, there's no sort of specific cut point for core versus fringe, but I think the visual can be deceptive in that there are far fewer core words than fringe words, and yet we use core words much more than we use fringe words. So I just wanted to kind of show that the representation that we have here in blue and in yellow kind of represents the size of the set of words, but it doesn't necessarily reflect that 80-20% split that we have in speech, in which case it would sort of be reversed, where the core words section would be really big, representing 80% of our spoken language, and the fringe words would be really small. So let's see. This is also why, with this frequency and flexibility that we have with the core words, that's really why we want them to be so prominent in our AAC systems. Is we need the most bang for our buck. And so if we get words that we can reuse and we can use in different situations and across contexts, and we can use them for different meanings, then that's a lot of bang for our buck. So if we were just interested in talking about spoken language, then this could be the end of our story right here, right? We could double back and say, okay, let's talk about our mismatch and how that happens with spoken language. But in fact, we are also interested in what's going on educationally. The words that are emphasized for instruction and the terminology used in educational settings is not the same as what we have here for communication. The words core words and fringe words, those are not words that are familiar to educators. And where we have our emphasis here on core words, that isn't necessarily true for the vocabulary that we're using in the educational setting. So this picture is a good representation of spoken words, but it doesn't really tell us where we're going to find our academic learning targets. So really we need to know what types of words are being taught in the school, and we need to know that to help us to determine what opportunities we might have for using core words in that setting. And we need to really look at our educational vocabulary from a slightly different perspective than the one that we've used here. So if we want to know how to focus, how that focus of our academic content is going to align with our focus of core words, then let's look at a slightly different way of classifying these words. And luckily, there is a simple system that is familiar to many educators used for discussing vocabulary. This vocabulary system is by a woman named Isabel Beck, and it categorizes vocabulary according to different tiers. So you see here Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And those tiers are based on a larger set of words used by what she would call mature language users. So they're speakers and individuals that are in the educational setting, etc. If we were to take a look at Tier 1, which is the first tier, those words are the most basic forms of words. So they're represented in oral language. So typically the language that we're using verbally with individuals before they're headed off to school, those are Tier 1 words. They're also the words that are targeted for reading first, because they're already known to the children that are coming in through listening vocabulary and speaking vocabulary. So then they move them and address them through the reading vocabulary. And the assumption is that Tier 1 words are already known to kids, so their meanings are not explicitly taught at school. The Tier 2 words, which is the next level, those are more abstract words, and those are considered the best words to target for instruction, because they're rich and they're interesting, and yet they're still more flexible than the more precise Tier 3 words, which we'll get to in a minute. So as compared to Tier 1, Tier 1 is sort of your most basic way of saying something. If I were to say enormous, that's really a Tier 2 word, right? Because I can break that down to mean really, really big, which would be Tier 1 words. So basically, if you can't break down a word into any more simple of a form, then it's a Tier 1. If you can break it down and it's a little more abstract or complex or specific, then it would be a Tier 2 word. And this is a little bit more of an art than a science. Tier 2 words are often able to be used across topics, across texts, across subjects, things like that. So they're not a one-to-one correspondence between this word belongs with this particular subject matter, which is more of a Tier 3 word. So let's take a look at Tier 3. Those are the most precise words, and they consider them topic-specific or domain-specific words, and they're specialized to certain topics. They do need to receive instruction, meaning that they're not automatically known. It's assumed that Tier 3 words would need to be instructed. Sometimes they can be more visual because there's more of a one-to-one correspondence between Tier 3 words and the vocabulary that they represent. So you might see science vocabulary and kind of all of the science terms related to cells, etc. All of those words are Tier 3 words. They're very specific. One of the interesting things is that sometimes we find Tier 3 words on augmentative communication systems along with maybe some Tier 1 words and not much in between. And I think sometimes that's because Tier 3 words can be really good picture producers. You can produce a picture to represent that concept, and so it makes it it appears to be an easier target. But in fact, we'll talk a little bit about that's not really the case, that those aren't really the best words, whether it's for an AAC user or just another student. We really want to target more of the Tier 2 words. Those make more sense. So this is the basic structure for educators to use to determine which words they're going to target for instruction. And in general, as I said, the most powerful words are going to be Tier 2 words, but you're also going to find that there are going to be Tier 3 words that are in the curriculum associated with specific units of study that will be instructed. So for now, let's take a look and see how this tiered system, which is again more educationally relevant, matches to our core and fringe systems. Okay, so this is probably the most dense slide in the whole presentation. So hopefully you're sticking with me and it's still making sense. But I'm trying to merge these two ideas because it's such an important concept to understand. And if we can't bridge between the communication conversation and the educational vocabulary conversation, we're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities to kind of for one to support the other. So see what we can do here. So here we see our 3 tiers at the top, and then we see our core and fringe at the bottom. But now we've got them both kind of on the same background of that frequency and flexibility. So part of the reason that I did that was to show that even though they're different classification systems, one referencing more academic vocabulary and the other referencing spoken vocabulary, we're still talking about the same set of words. They're just sort of sorted differently. And we can use those attributes of frequency and flexibility to view both of those, right? So there's our tier 3 words on the top that are used less frequent and they're less flexible. And then we have fringe words below that. Again, we have certain fringe words on the end to the far right that are used very little and really less flexible. The other thing that we can see from this is that our core words, which are primarily in blue, those are completely contained within the tier 1 kind of segment. So directly above the core words, you find tier 1, and core words do not extend over into the tier 2 section. So all of our core words and then some fringe words are all tier 1 words. So that's good to know, because quite honestly, a lot of times I will talk about using tier 1 words, which is a familiar term to educators, as opposed to saying core words, and that can be a little bit more accessible for folks. So these, just to point out too, that tier 2 and 3 are entirely composed of fringe words. So there are no core words there. So let's see what we can, if I add in one other element to this so that we can place our AAC systems. Here we have our communication system, and I've put it down the bottom here to show that it is well entrenched in our core words, right? So we may have some fringe words on our system, so I kind of show that yes, we're moving a little bit into the yellow, but for the most part we have a core-based system. So if we look at this display, let me see if I can translate some of the other elements for you. We can see that the core words are here in blue, and then we transition more into the fringe words for the rest of the speaking vocabulary. Up here under the vocabulary for instruction, you see that the tier 1 words are in white. Remember when I talked about tier 1 words were not targeted for instruction at school, or at least vocabulary instruction? So there's no highlighting here because they're not vocabulary targets. Tier 2 is really where you'll see the intensive targeting of vocabulary, and then again some of tier 3. So here's our first mismatch. Look at where we have our communication system in this column here, and look at there's no instruction happening here. So that's really our first mismatch, is we don't have any instruction naturally happening for the words that are in our communication system. And it's just going to create a little bit more of a challenge for us in order to be able to deal with that. So let's see. And we can see that all of these words here we probably don't have on our system, and those are all words that are corresponding with the tier 2 and tier 3 words. So here's where the instruction is happening, tier 2 and into tier 3, and those are not the words that we have on our system. So interestingly, I think this may be a good place to bring up a little bit of information about the relationship between tier 1 and tier 2 words. In one of her books, Isabel Beck talks about how when children are first learning to read, as we saw in the chart, they're reading tier 1 words because those are the words that they know how to say and they understand. But the teacher is exposing them to tier 2 words through read alouds and other teacher reading or supported reading, so that they get exposed to new vocabulary. When children are talking about those tier 2 words and when they're defining those tier 2 words, they're using tier 1 words to do that. So they're using what they have and what they know to talk about a more complex concept. And this is going to be relevant when we start talking about what we're going to do with our mismatch, what we're going to do about the fact that we have all of these words that are occurring up in this end and the tier 2 instruction, and yet we have access to a really small set of words. But I thought that was an interesting analogy, how young children, when they're first starting to read, they're going to resort to the words that they know in order to explain the things that they don't know. So, okay. So what are we going to do? We've identified that we have a couple of mismatches here. That instruction is occurring in places where we don't have supports, and we have supports in places where there is no instruction. So what do we do about this? That's our initial question, right? What do we do when there's a mismatch between the words we have available in our system? And I'll go back. Here's our words, and the ones we need for speaking and for learning, right? Well, how about this? What if we were to funnel the words that we don't have access to through the words that we do have access to? So we would translate, if you will, the diverse quantity of words found in spoken language and in the curriculum into the smaller set of core words. Now, think, on a small scale about the example I just gave you about the young children learning to read. They take more complex thoughts and they translate them to the more basic terminology that they're facile with, right? So we're just sort of talking about doing that on a larger scale. What we want to be able to do is express a range of messages, ideas, and information using primarily core vocabulary, so we'll try and stick with that 80%, and then fringe vocabulary support, so 20% or percent 20 as that says. We also want to provide access to the curriculum by taking those curriculum concepts and expressing those concepts, knowledge, and information that are in the tier 2 and tier 3 vocabulary currently using tier 1 vocabulary. So again, I'm sort of using tier 1 and core interchangeably. They're not, but for the purposes of talking to educators, core vocabulary is subsumed by tier 1 vocabulary. So it's an easy language to use. And if we bring it down to tier 1 and it's still not basic enough, or it's not in the core, we can kind of funnel it through again, right? So it's like using a ricer, and you rice it up again and make it a finer grain. So that tier 1 vocabulary is really going to be the core and the basic fringe vocabulary. Same thing as the one above. So how are we going to be able to do this? How is this possible that we have all of these words that are not available, and we think we're going to funnel them through this small set of words that we have, whatever that number is? The answer to that is flexibility. So remember our chart that talked about frequency and flexibility. One is actually a function of the other. Tier 1 words, and especially our core words, are flexible. And what makes them flexible, number one, is the words don't represent just a single thing. So especially for the non-nouns, which the core words are non-nouns, it isn't a one-to-one correspondence. So let's take a look. You may remember this from Core 101, is here's the word different. And there are 5 different meanings for that one word, from a different book, meaning a new book, to your picture is different, meaning dissimilar, and all the way around to unequal or subtraction or strange. Those are sort of just synonyms for the word different, used in different ways, right? There's 5 words that we can get out of one core word. Words also can, when they're flexible, they can mean different things depending on the context. So depending on what I'm talking about, depending on where I am, depending on what I'm doing, depending on who I'm with, the same word can mean something different. And I'll show you an example that will include that, as well as the next point, which is when we combine words with other tier 1 and core words, it becomes an explosion of possibilities. We can really expand our meaning by putting more than one word, core word, together. So here's just a quick example of the word turn, and on the one side, on the left, you see different contexts. So you see when I'm reading a book, or I'm playing a game, or I'm playing with a toy, or watching TV. And on the right side, you see a different phrase for each context where I could use the word turn. So the meaning of the word is changing depending on the context, and depending on the words that are around it. So that's an example of those last two factors of flexibility. So I'm just trying to really convince you that this is possible with the core. Core words are really powerful, and they're the reason that we want to really support those with our AAC users. And let's just talk a little bit about some of the benefits. I will go back in a minute and give you more details about how to do that translation. But first, let's talk again about the benefits. So when we increase our use of core vocabulary, remember before how I was talking about that we don't have any instructional context for teaching core words or tier 1 words, right? That's just not part of the curriculum. So we have to find opportunities to do that, and if we don't, they're not going to kind of appear on their own. We know that we need a certain quantity of modeling of core words or any words in order to move our person with Angelman syndrome or other complex communication needs toward expression with that word. So we need numbers, we need frequency, lots of use of the same word in different contexts. So the more we can find opportunities to use the word, the higher those numbers go, the faster they kind of grow. The other benefit is we get more familiar with the core words when we use them more. So I know where they are in the system. I know how to apply them. I get more comfortable with them. And that, again, is for the student or the individual and their partner. I also am expanding my understanding about what a word can mean. So I didn't think about that the turn could mean like twisting something as along with rotating, along with flipping, those are all different variations of the word turn, and the more I think about it, the more I'll come up with. So I'm expanding my understanding of the core words as well as for the individual I'm supporting. A big plus for using that increased core is decreasing those programming demands. So how many of you are spending time programming in lots and lots of those tier 3 words that next week or next month are going to be long forgotten, and yet we've spent all this time programming them with that perception that that's going to be demonstrate learning. Much better to focus on the concepts that those tier 3 words represent and translate those into the core, which you'll see some examples of in a minute. And that's powerful. That's powerful in many respects, pertaining to that next point here, which is that important connection between the curriculum and tier 2 and tier 3 words and the core. So again, that translation, right? We take a word that is new or unfamiliar, and we translate it using words that we know, and that's how we can demonstrate comprehension. And then we also get more opportunities for expressive use of our core words if we can connect that to what's going on in the classroom or what people are saying that may not be part of my core, but I can kind of, again, do that little bit of a translation. Okay, we have another solution with my angel wings on Gail Van Tatenhove here. Another way of thinking about this translation process is by using something called descriptive language. And you're going to find some great resources about descriptive language by Bruce Baker, by Katya Hill, and of course by Gail Van Tatenhove here. So what I'm going to do is just walk you through how to access some of those resources and give you a little bit more specifics about that translation process and how to use what you have to represent what you don't have. So here we have a definition of descriptive language, which is the ability to talk about something, to describe how or where or when, opposed to naming what. and that is a critical skill for teaching core vocabulary. So core vocabulary is much better represented by all of those kind of qualitative parameters of how, where, when, what, as opposed to just naming something, a word, and saying this is what it represents. So underneath it says, don't just tell me what it is, talk about what it does, how it feels, how it looks, how it moves, how it acts, where it is, what it's like. Those are all ways that you can take non-core words and translate them into core. And I think that we have a couple of examples. So here's some simple examples. So if you have a frog and you want to talk about the frog, but you don't have that particular noun, what can you say about it? Well, let's describe it. It's small, and it's green, and it's wet or in water, and it jumps, right? Those are, in the context of a science lesson, would be really clear what we're talking about. I don't have the word run. That maybe that's too, that just isn't available on my system. I could use fast and walk. Again, look at how when we combine those two, that was one of our clues, is combining words is a powerful way to use core. Grandfather could be represented by these three: old and man and family. Tall, green, and out or outside could be a representation for a tree. So again, give yourself license to sort of think outside the box, and freedom to think about what these words really mean. Here's some great guiding questions from Rosemary Portera. The Pixon Tell Me About guide is where these came from, and there's a visual here about that I enlarged to show you some of the pictures that she's used for student supports, and this link is in your resources list. But these are some of the questions that she uses to help expand beyond just the referential language, which is more naming, into that descriptive language. So what does it do, and what are the parts, and what's the size, and what color is it, and what belongs with it, what shape is it, what is it like, where is it from? Those are ways that you can talk about something without having to actually name it, and still do a very great job of showing comprehension and demonstrating that you know the word, or that this is the specific word that you're talking about. So I did want to show you, because I know you'll get a copy of the printout of this presentation, exactly where to find some of Gail's Pixon project curriculum examples, because they are really one of a kind at this point. There's nothing else like them out there, and I want to make sure that you can find them. So if you go to www.minspeak.com and you click on Teachers and Therapists, and then the subtitle Intervention Planning, you will get to a page where it shows you some options, and you want to choose Teaching Materials Exchange. And then you want to choose Curriculum Supports. And then you will see a list of all kinds of examples, from science to social studies to language arts to math to music to art. And you can click on those, and it will take you to usually a PowerPoint, a PDF example of, I believe it was mostly high school curriculum that Gail has translated in various ways into using descriptive language, and then into her Pixon representations. But they work for everybody. So I'm just going to run through a couple of these, and then show you some of the supports that I've included in the resource guide. So here's an example for math, counting, and cardinality, where these are the, like, quantity is how much, or comparison words. So she's pulled out some core words that can be used in lieu of maybe some of the more specific math words. Here's a great one related to the story Grammar Marker, which is a registered system for talking about story elements. But character is really, who, right? Isn't that a simple word to talk about a character? A setting is where and when. A kickoff again, what happened or what do. Feelings, lots of times we have feelings as part of our core, and on and on. Again, you can look at some of the specifics, but I really just want you to get the idea that even something as complex as these high school curriculum examples, if you use a good process, are accessible. Here's a great one on map skills. And you can see going up top, going down bottom, left and right, what way to go. Those are, simple core words that we can use to talk about the social studies map terms. This is an example of some of the Pixon representations from Gale's system, and these are specifically verbs that have to do with energy. So if you, I love these verbs, think of forces in motion and things, push and put and hold and stop and go and pull and drop, those store, those are core words, and yet they really work for those science concepts, and you don't need to have necessarily those specific science words. Here's some great examples of the water cycle terminology. So a little hard to read, but cycle, water, and sun used for defining evaporation. Transpiration is vapor, plant, and air. Condensation, a cloud and a rain and snow. We'll talk in a minute about how to come up with what core words match some of these more specific curriculum concepts, because most of the time they're not in our lexicon and we need some support with figuring out which core words are going to work. But if you have the process and you bring it to someone who knows the content, then that would work. So this is, again, the water cycle. What happens during condensation? Water vapor cools off, makes clouds. Clouds get heavy with water, and so on. This was her descriptive discussion about solids, liquids, and gas. Take the shape of what it is in. Take the shape of what it is in, fills all up with a gas would do that. Let's see. Here's some planet examples about revolution and orbit and rotate. And here are some adjectives that you can use for planets, when talking about planets. So these are relevant to the features of a planet. And think about how, wouldn't these be great for all students in that class to have access to? Okay, so I talked a minute ago about having a process that you use to kind of walk through. And I say, because I work in the schools, and either if you have a child, they're either headed to school or they're coming from school. So kind of knowing this process, particularly if they're in the school system or they're headed there, is important. And if they're not, you can still adapt this to whatever context you're in. If you're in a work environment, or another, shared housing or some other situation where you need to work with others, you just replace the terms as appropriate. Okay, so here I talk about a process to move from your tier 2 and tier 3 words to tier 1 and core. So you want to start with, what's the topic? What are we talking about? So we saw we had planets, and we had forces in motion, and we had water cycle, things like that. The next question I want to know is, what are the important concepts, knowledge, and or skills that you want all students to learn related to this topic? And I might let them start with telling me that in whatever language that they want, but then I'm going to ask them, could you put that in plain language? And that's the critical piece, because if they can explain it to you in plain language, I guarantee they're probably already using tier 1 language when they do that. So if you write that down, you probably can do an easy translation to some of the core words from that. What's the key vocabulary related to this topic? And just to make a note, I will you'll have access to a form with these questions on it in your resources. Okay, so then once you get the information about the curriculum, then you want to collaborate with your general educator if possible, and anyone else that, speech language pathologists, anyone else that can help to identify what core vocabulary could be used to represent those important concepts and knowledge and skills. So that's where you're going to do your translation. So you're going to have to kind of break that down, and I will say it's a skill, meaning it takes practice, not a skill that some people have, some people don't. It's the more you do it, the better you get, right? So it's not going to be perfect right off. That's okay. But the more you do it, the better you're going to get, the more closely your choices are going to be to the words that you're trying to represent. So represent those key concepts, represent the key vocabulary. Sometimes these are one and the same. I'm going to show you an example in a minute where the important concepts and the key vocabulary are combined because it just made sense. And then identify, if necessary, which of the information that you've gathered you're going to prioritize for your learners. So if you have lots of vocabulary or lots of key concepts, you may say which of these is most important, or which of these can we work with and address some of our other language targets as well. So here's an example that it's from an earlier lesson, but I actually just did this a week or so ago with a team where we identified the topic and we identified the learning targets for the class. And I have a question mark there because I'm not exactly sure if those are adapted learning targets or if those were the whole class learning targets. So I'm going to fess up that may or may not be the whole class learning targets, but they might look something like that. The key vocabulary for this topic. So these were the actual curriculum terms that all of the students were using. And then here you see a combination of the concept and the topic vocabulary in core/tier 1 vocabulary. So you'll see there are some nouns, but that's okay because they are in a good distribution. There's not a predominance of nouns. There are people words, describing words, action words, and I purposely put those categories there to help us really see visually that we have a good distribution of core words, and that we're, again, not sort of falling prey to the nouns are easier kind of thing. So I like to see on a visual scale like that I have a representation of different types of words. And then the personal learning targets, I do know that those were the questions that this particular student was going to be answering. So this was a high school science lesson. I think it was 10th grade science lesson. So hopefully that will help you to get an idea of what this process looks like. And again, that is going to be in your handouts. Okay, so the takeaway from what we've talked about so far. Fringe words, tier 1, 2, and 3 words can translate into more basic tier 1 and core words. So this is possible, I guess, is what that is saying, that you can do that, okay? The translation process can be used for reading, writing, speaking, and listening. We didn't really talk about the difference in those different medium, but I just think about, you can translate a book into the core. You can translate what someone is saying. You can translate anything. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say here, is the process is the same regardless of how you're applying it. The process works the same for informal, like casual conversations, and formal contexts. The caveat to that is, so a formal context might be a curriculum lesson. An informal context, which is, there's a conversation going on and I'd like to be able to put that into core, that usually is happening on the fly. I usually don't have a lot of notice about that, which means I just have to be comfortable with doing the best I can in the moment with finding words and missing some words, and that's okay. And I'm going to find others, and I'm going to be better next time. So if you are trying to do this translation for kind of real-time conversation, that's wonderful. I would encourage you to also do some of the pre-planning format, because it will make you feel more confident and make you feel better about your skills to sort of think ahead about situations and prepare for them, and kind of know what you might be using for words, and kind of have a balance of both. And that's kind of where the last point is, that real-time modeling, it will take time and practice, but you can do it. You can do it. We can all do it. Okay, so I believe that this is the last part before our next steps. So just wrapping up, but I'm going to link to the resources document because I do want you to see what that looks like. Okay, so this is the webinar resources document, and what I've done is let's see if I can do a different view for you. Okay, so what I've done is showed you what type of resource it is. Is it a document? Is it a PDF? Is it a paper? Is it a website or a book? So you can kind of get an idea of the different types of resources. And then these are all names of files that I've created for this presentation. And the reason I've listed them like this, which is a little different than what they look like in a file name, is I wanted you to see that there's a rhyme or reason to the file names. So most of the names are going to start with the word model, because these are files that are going to help you support you in modeling. The second part of the name of the file tells what type of activity you can model using that file. So for instance, this particular document is helpful for modeling during calendar time. That's the example that I was giving you. The vocabulary that's included on that example is the core vocabulary. So here you'll see sometimes it's core and sometimes it's core 40. So in a moment I'll open one of them up and show you what that looks like. And then I either tell you the name of the app that I used, if it's a completed example, or I say it's blank, so that you can fill it all in. And for most of them, if I included a completed example, I've also included a blank version of that. And I tried to give you a range of documents to work from. You'll also see here making the curriculum descriptive, the plants example, and then the blank form. So let's see what else. So this is a sample of what a blank version of the a planner might look like. So I talked a minute ago about preparing for situations ahead of time. So the plants example was a preparation, but it was sort of topic specific. Here's an example of a form, and let's view it on focus. This is a kind of template for shared reading, and what I did was I thought about shared reading, and I thought about the range of core words that we have available, and I recorded what core words I thought would be a good match for shared reading. You also see these hit 1, 2, and 3. Because this is sort of a cheat sheet for planning purposes, I like to record the navigation to get to that word for the particular system. Now, because I haven't used an app in this example, I don't have anything written here. In the next example, I'll show you that. But this is a great way to kind of be prepared with where would I find this word and to map it out. And the other thing you can see here is some sample phrases. Again, this can be really helpful when you're in the moment to kind of look at those sample phrases and say, oh yeah, I could say that with this core word, etc. So I don't have lots and lots filled in, but hopefully I have enough to get you started with that. Okay, so this is one of the same document, but this one is filled in with those navigation. So this is a shared reading activity using core vocabulary selected for shared reading. The program that the student was using was TouchChat, and the page set was 42 Basic. So the word who is located under the questions target for this particular app. You'll see for instance, some of the nouns, you have 2 hits to get to those nouns. But that's kind of what it would look like if you wanted to use this as a cheat sheet. Now, what I usually do is create this master document, and then from this, we make a copy and we delete lots and lots of these rows and only focus on a couple of the words. So I might have, I don't know, 25 or 30 words selected here. I might only pick to focus on 1 word in each category. And so I might print out the page that just has 1 question word, 1 social word, 1 pronoun, and where I can locate it and some of the phrases that would go with it. So hopefully this makes as much sense to you as it does to me. And if it doesn't, you go ahead on Facebook and you can ask me in the Facebook group what you don't understand. The last document that I'll share with you is the curriculum planner vocabulary selection. So this is the one where I said I would walk you through those 6 questions where you want to get ask your general educator information and where you have a color-coded list. So this is just a place to document that information so you can ask the teacher, what are the important concepts and can you put that in plain language and what's the key vocabulary? But it's just something to help you plan if you don't have anything. Okay, so almost done here. Whoops. Possible next steps. So link to one of the forums or link to one of the websites or articles or other documents. Even just link to the resources page that's on the Angelman site. Practice using descriptive language by translating 1 word, that is tier 2, in 1 activity into a core word. So baby steps, right? Download that last forum, the Making Curriculum Descriptive, and bring it to school. So, bring it with you if you're an educator, speech pathologist, try it out. If you're in another context, use it in any way that makes sense to you. Share this webinar link with others that would benefit from understanding the concept of descriptive language, and share the resource list and the resources on it. Please, as much as we can spread the news and the information, that would be great. I believe Caroline's going to be able to answer some questions, and if you have questions that we don't have time for, or you want to send them into Facebook, I'm happy to answer those. Thank you so much for your time.